He is really good at hyping people up. So thank you so much. I'm actually really excited to be here in Budapest. This is my first time here, but I'm even more excited that I get to talk to you all about something that's very important to me, very important to the tech community. So today we're going to spend some time talking about accessibility, but more important than that, like you mentioned, it's building empathy for our users. So I'm a software engineer at Microsoft in Seattle, Washington. Back at home, my husband and I take our two awesome dogs on lots of outdoor adventures, and I spend way too much time building mechanical keyboards, but it's a problem. Day to day, though, I work on a team at Microsoft that builds an internal design system and component library. And really our goal is to provide an experience that's fully accessible out of the box for all of our internal products and services. And so being able to support these teams to building rich and accessible tools is one of the core things that I focus on day to day. And I've been on this team for about 3 years now, but working on design systems even before that. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, if you love dogs or keyboards or accessibility, find me on Twitter after this talk during the conference. But one of the biggest reasons that I'm excited to give this particular talk today is that I have a chronic illness, and it causes various levels of disability day to day. And I think that typically we don't see accessibility talks given by someone who's in the community. So I'm really excited to talk, and I'm really excited for Anke to talk too right after mine, after the coffee break, about his experiences as well. And it's something that's so important because it's not just affecting us in the tech community, right? Like tech is integrated into every part of everybody's life. And so we are the ones responsible for making these things that are used by everyone across the world. So the goal today isn't going to get super technical, but I want to give you the knowledge and the tools so that you can build your empathy and you can start to research more on your own and understand, here's what's available to me and here's how I can change how I work to build products that are more accessible. And then I will, after this talk, post a link on my Twitter to the slides so that you can have the full list of resources for everything that I've covered and all of the tools as well. So let's start out by talking about what disabled means. So in my intro, I said that I have a chronic illness and I have various levels of disability, which may be confusing to some of you right now, but we'll talk about some of that later. But when you think of someone who's disabled, you're probably not thinking of this, right? You might be thinking of someone who might use a mobility aid, maybe a guide dog, a wheelchair. But really, disabled people can look like anyone. Really, all it means is you have some sort of physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of a major life activity. And we'll talk about this a little bit deeper, but if you think about it, that's a really broad statement, and people can be impacted in so many ways, and they can be completely unique to their situation. But what's really important, I think, is that 90% of disabilities are invisible, like mine. You're not going to look at me and immediately say, oh, yes, she needs an accommodation, right? You might not think twice about someone who has an invisible disability, but they need accommodations and they need to be thought of as a core part of your user base, just like everyone else. And worldwide, 1 billion people experience some form of disability. 1 billion people. It's 15% of the world's population. That's a lot of people. So what does being accessible and creating an accessible product actually mean? So there's a couple things that we'll break down when we talk about accessibility and disabilities, and everyone is going to be different, of course, but there's 3 main categories that we look at when it comes to the intersection of disability and accessible solutions. So first we have permanent disabilities. These will not change over time. They're not dependent on a situation or environment. And I'm going to try to keep a consistent example as we go along. So a permanent disability might be someone without an arm. That's not going to change, and they're going to need accommodations for that. A temporary disability may change or improve over time, but it's still not dependent on the situation that that person is in. So this could be a person that has their arm in a cast or a brace. They don't have use of their arm for this particular time, and they are going to need similar accommodations to someone who has a permanent disability. And then this isn't really like a category of disabilities, but it is still something that we think about when we create accessible products, is this situational category. And they're going to need similar accommodations based on the situation that they're in. And this might be a parent carrying a child in one arm. Now they only have their other free arm to interact with whatever product. So kind of for my personal example, when I mentioned that I had varying levels of accommodations that I might need based on how my illness impacts me on that day, in that hour, my illness is permanent. It's not going to change, but it can give me some symptoms where I might have like a temporary disability that's a little more specific. So I had hand surgery a couple years ago because of my disability, and I was in a cast for many months, and I couldn't really use that hand, and so I had to find workarounds to like brush my teeth or brush my hair, right? I couldn't cook for myself. I couldn't make the bed for myself. And now I'm mostly fine in my hand. I can do most things, but there are some times where I might have to kind of make similar accommodations based on how it's going that day. So I want to touch a little bit on some data and statistics, specifically about accessibility in public spaces. So I know that, we're an international audience. I'm from the United States, so I'm going to focus mostly on data from there, but there are similar regulations and issues in many regions, including the UK and EU. But in the US, we have something called the Americans with Disabilities Act, and this helps protect the rights of disabled people, and it sets guidelines to how public things should be made accessible. And so when you typically think of that, you might think of wheelchair ramps or like automatic door opening buttons. But it actually provides protections all across like web-related accessibility. And then specifically in the EU, you have the European Accessibility Act and then the Web Accessibility Directive. And now here's kind of where there are some differences, where the European Accessibility Act covers products and services identified as being most important, which is very subjective, right? And what's important to one person might not be important to another person, and it might not be covered, and it might not be enough to provide similar experiences for a disabled person. And so this can lead to some pretty glaring gaps as far as like what actually ends up being accessible. But this is the most recent data for the US, spanning a decade. And these are all of the violations that have been filed at the federal level. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're all like completely valid or any of that, but these are cases where someone said, hey, this experience was not accessible to me as a disabled person. I'm going to go complain to someone about it. And the numbers are trending mostly up. They've gone down a little bit in the last couple years, but like 8,000 cases per year is still a number bigger than zero. And it's really something that we need to think about and we need to do better in. And one of the most prominent recent cases in the United States, a court ruled in favor of a blind plaintiff, and they found that Winn-Dixie, which is a chain grocery store, their website was inaccessible. and it held Winn-Dixie responsible for conforming to certain accessibility standards. And then later, this ruling was overturned, and the court found that a website was not a place of public accommodation, and it didn't pose a barrier to accessing the Winn-Dixie stores physically in person. And so to translate, what this is really saying is that disabled people don't matter, right? If your disability is preventing you from using a website that's publicly available, that everyone else has access to, that's too bad. You're forced to use an entirely different experience. And in this case, they're saying, well, you can just go to the Winn-Dixie store in person, but maybe your disability makes that more difficult or not possible, and that's why you were using their site in the first place, right? So it's not an equitable experience for an able-bodied user and a disabled user. And really, as technology grows and affects more and more aspects of people's lives, we need to do better. We need to create products and websites and experiences that can be used by everyone. Like, legal obligation or not, we have a moral duty to build our empathy for users and create those experiences. So now you may be thinking, how do I do that? That seems hard and complicated and really involved. And really the answer is that you don't have to do that much. Most assistive technology is meant to do the hard work of like translating alternative inputs, like maybe turning eye movement into like a cursor movement that your app would typically expect. But our jobs as developers and designers and product makers is to follow the coding conventions of the language that you're using to write your app in. And that's going to lead to apps that have as few barriers as possible out of the box. So specifically for our case as mostly web developers, we have to make sure that at the end of the day, the HTML that is, created in our DOM is semantic, and that we're using carefully designed UI libraries, component libraries, design systems that care about accessibility and bake that into their products. And from there, you might have to add some extra accessibility attributes to your code. And then there sometimes might be cases where you should take a step back and be like, is this really the best design? Can we just avoid this accessibility issue altogether by maybe thinking about our design a little bit better? So I'll very briefly touch on some design things, even though this is a developer conference, because accessibility really does start fundamentally at the design level. And these are the things that we typically think about as designers. I work with designers every single day. But accessibility isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, right? We have to think about all of these different categories. And I think the most important part that I want to drive home is that there's sometimes a misconception that accessible design can't look nice. And there's this really bad take that was posted a while ago saying that there's this concept of this aesthetic, accessible paradox, and you don't want to be too accessible because then your product's not going to look nice, and you're going to alienate people who are able-bodied. And that's very ableist. And you can't really alienate a able-bodied person. They are living in a world that is built for them. And we have to think about the people who live in a world that is not built for them. So their needs shouldn't be treated the same. It's 100% possible to have an accessible, beautiful design. And really, at the end of the day, humans aren't edge cases. And we shouldn't treat them as one, right? We shouldn't say, we're just going to ignore this 15% of our user base. It's not moral, it's not ethical. We have to include everyone. Typically, we look at low vision and color blindness as core concepts of accessible design. And this will involve working with things like contrast ratios and minimizing distractions. So when we talk about low vision users as being like a core tenet of accessibility. Usually we handle those cases by making sure that the colors that we choose meet specific contrast ratios that are outlined by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And so there's 3 different levels in these guidelines, and they cover a whole range of like functional and visual aspects of your design and your product. And typically you want to reach like the highest level of accessibility that you can, but at a minimum, you should really aim for at least level AA. And so they kind of specify like the contrast ratios for these 2 levels, and larger text or other like decorative and branding text can kind of be excluded from this because really you're trying to build something that functionally serves like the correct purpose for your user. So in addition to contrast ratios, we also want to be thinking about people who may have color blindness, and that means that we shouldn't really rely on color alone to convey meaning. So you always want to pair color up with text or iconography or something else that's going to relay your meaning to a user. And for things like charts and graphs, that might be difficult to think about at first, but typically you can use things like different shades of the same color or patterns in your charts so that they can easily be matched up to a legend. So if you're a designer or you work with designers and they use Figma, there's a really great plugin called Colorblind, and that will emulate what your design looks like with different types of color blindness. And then for engineers, there's a great website called Who Can Use, and you provide your foreground and background colors, and it will show you the contrast ratios, the grade that it receives, and then it will also simulate the different types of color blindness and what your text will look like in those scenarios. So this is like an ugly example. You would probably never put this color combination in your product, but it does meet color contrast ratios for typical vision users. But then when you look at the color blindness simulators, like they're all failures. And so like these are kind of the cases that you want to be thinking about where, it's not good enough to just meet contrast ratios for a typical vision user. And then directly in DevTools, you can check your color contrast. You can check what levels are required. And then you can see like the lines in the color space, and that will tell you what color options will help you meet the AA and AAA levels. And then I personally really love this in-depth guide published by Stripe. It's all about designing accessible color systems, and it goes really in depth on how to make these beautiful experiences that are accessible. So now we're like living in this world where our designers are on top of their accessibility game. Everything that they've produced like meets all of these requirements, but just because our design is visually accessible doesn't mean that it's functional for everyone. Many users won't use our products with traditional input devices like a mouse or a trackpad. So it's important that we use these semantic coding conventions so that the assistive technology tools can properly translate our code and our app into whatever tool our disabled users are going to be using. So when we talk about writing semantic HTML, that really means that we need to use the proper syntax and elements that HTML provides out of the box. So if you look at this piece of code, it's kind of hard to tell like the hierarchy or the structure or the intent behind this code. And you really can't do that unless you start making assumptions about like, what is this header class? What is this description? But if we were to rewrite that same code using semantic HTML, we can very easily at a glance tell the structure, the hierarchy, and the functionality. And the same way that we do this when we're reading code and interpreting it, the assistive technology tool is going to be reading the code and interpreting it and parsing it into something that's going to be usable by screen readers and keyboards and things like that. So I'm going to touch on a few very key high-level points, specifically for implementing your apps. And the first is alt text. And this is where I see a lot of maybe not the best practices, because you think oh, I'm just gonna write some alt text that describes my image, done, problem solved. But really the importance of an alt text is to provide the same context that a visioned user has compared to someone who might be using a screen reader. So imagine that you're writing a site and you have a picture of a painting of a flower on your site. If your site is focused on nature and the biology of a flower, your alt text should go into the details of the biological elements of a flower. I don't know, I'm not a botanist. But if your site is focused on painting techniques and art, then your alt text might be more focused on the colors used, the artistic techniques, the mediums that are used in this image. And just because an image is present on your site doesn't necessarily mean you need to add alt text either. Your alt text could just be an empty string if the image is purely decorative and doesn't add any additional context into what that site or page is about. The next thing I want to focus on is headings. Headings are super important because they help users using assistive technology to quickly skip through different parts of your page and be able to tell what the structure and hierarchy of your page is. So you need to make sure that your heading levels are hierarchical. Every page has at least one heading to kind of set the context and the stage of what that page is about. And what's really important here is that every piece of text that looks and acts like a heading should be a semantic heading. But just because you want bigger text, it's bold or styled a certain way, doesn't mean it should be a heading if it's not used to structure the outline of your page. It's hard, but use CSS for things that are purely stylistic. The next thing is links versus buttons, and this gets a lot of attention during accessibility talks. So very quickly, links should always navigate somewhere like browser navigation, opening up a file and email anchors in a page, whereas buttons should be used to perform an action within your page. And I think the biggest key here is that people will say, well, I don't like how this link looks. I want it to be a link, but I want it to look like a button. And again, I'll say use CSS to make things visually look the way you want. Don't use semantic HTML in weird ways that they were not meant to be used. But the biggest issue that I personally see a lot of with links is that they don't provide enough context into where the link is taking a user. So when you're using a screen reader, the screen reader is going to read out, read more. Read more what? I have no idea what this link is going to do. But a really easy accessibility trick to use is to drop in some visually hidden DOM element, and that is going to help set extra context for screen reader users. Because the accessibility tree will include visually hidden DOM elements. And so in the second example, it will say, read more in the docs, and you can keep making it even more descriptive, but it won't visually show the in the docs as being part of your link. So it kind of helps balance making your site look nice while providing the context that users need. And this is just for reference. This code is pulled from the Ally project, and it's just a really handy snippet for achieving that visually hidden HTML. So if you follow kind of these rules, you're really setting yourself up for success. So then we can kind of start transitioning into talking about testing. And testing is really important. There's a whole concept of test-driven development, and whether or not you buy into that, that's a different conversation, but Accessibility, just like any other piece of functionality in your app, needs to be tested. Nothing is going to replace manual testing, especially manual testing done by someone who regularly uses the assistive technologies, because they are in there every day. They are probably using it in a very different way than someone like you or me might use it. But my biggest recommendation is to build empathy for your users and manually test your sites. The first thing you should do is try to learn how to use a screen reader. There's a couple different options for Windows and Mac, and it takes a while to get used to, and you're probably never going to be as good as a low vision user who's using a screen reader. But do it. It's good to familiarize yourself with it. And then a probably much easier thing for everyone to test is keyboarding, right? Like keyboarding is really an accessibility pattern, but it's also used by power users for, any app. And so the biggest things when you're testing keyboarding is focus. Your focus should always be visible. That's what's telling you where you are on the site at any given point. And keyboard focus should always follow a logical order. If you're tabbing through your site and your focus is jumping around, who knows where I'm going to go next? And it makes for a very chaotic experience for users. And most importantly, you should make sure that you're able to tab into and away from all interactive elements. There's some situations that you can get into where focus is trapped on a particular element, or an element keeps stealing back focus as you're tabbing through your app. And that basically makes your site unusable for someone who's relying solely on keyboard. Now, the best way that I found to test keyboarding is to click in your address bar and set your mouse aside and just start tabbing and shift tabbing to move through your app. And just really pay attention to where that focus is going. And if you ever lose track of your focus, that's a red flag that you're going to need to investigate. And usually that's caused by manually removing the focus in the pseudo class. And typically you'll see like an outline 0 or outline none. But you can also totally set outline to 0 or none and apply your own custom styles. And so that way you continue to fit into your design system and the visuals that you want to use while providing a good experience for your users. And then I use this pretty much every day. If you're struggling to find lost focus, you can use the document.activeElement live expression, and as you're tabbing through your site, it will update with the current element that has focus. And so it's very helpful for tracking, I don't visually see my focus, where is it, so that I can debug. And all of this may seem like a lot, but if you have a solid design and you've thought about accessibility and you're using semantic rules of whatever framework you're in, you should be most of the way there. And of course, you should be manually testing and you should be bringing in disabled users to validate your assumptions and validate your usability. But there's also some really great automated testing that you can do as a general check before you move on to the more involved manual testing phase. So I personally use Accessibility Insights basically every single day. They have a web extension, they have native tools for desktop and mobile, and this is a screenshot of their Fast Pass, which you run on a page and it will generate a list of all of the failures on your page, exactly what those failures are, the rules that they're breaking, and recommendations on how to fix them. And then you can actually have fully automated accessibility testing using Playwright. It's a really powerful tool for general automated end-to-end testing, but they also have a plugin that directly uses Axe Core under the hood, and it will just run the exact same accessibility test as this guy, but automated in your CI/CD pipelines. And this is what we use every day at work as well. So really all of these tools that I talked about today are designed to help you provide the most accessible product with the least amount of effort. but it still requires some effort, right? Building an accessible product can't start when you begin coding. It has to start at the design level. But really, when we don't prioritize accessibility, we're taking away the agency of our disabled users. But really what we have to do is actively, and I think this is the key, we have to be thinking about it every single day, every single time we write code. We have to declutter our designs and make our products focused on accessibility, both in design and in functionality. And I think at this point, like, we don't have an excuse anymore, right? We have so many tools at our disposal from beginning to end of the process, from our designs to our automated testing CI/CD pipelines. I think really what it comes down to at this point is building our own empathy so that we do make this kind of work a priority. So with that, I will send out the link on Twitter to the full slide deck, and it has a list of resources. That's very ominous to look at, but that will be super helpful for just understanding everything available to you so that you can dive deeper in your own day-to-day work. Thank you. Heck yeah.